Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to see you all. We'll jump into our next presentation about wastewater monitoring for the public health. This is a topic that's really interesting to me, and I'm very excited to hear what our presenters have to say about it. But first, a little bit about our presenters. Natalie Ram is a professor of law at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law and is adjunct faculty at the Berman Institute of Bioethics at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Ram is a leading scholar on the intersection of genetic privacy and the law. Her work has been published in law reviews and scientific journals, including Harvard Law Review, Columbia Law Review, Science, and Nature Biotechnology. Professor Ram has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Slate, and was interviewed on NPR's Science Friday and Reveal. She teaches courses in Maryland Carey Law's Law and Healthcare program and was a 2021 Greenwall Faculty Scholar in Bioethics. Before joining Maryland Carey Law, Professor Ram clerked for Judge Guido Calabresi of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and for Associate Justice Stephen G. Breyer at the U.S. Supreme Court. She earned her law degree at Yale Law School and an AB in Public and International Affairs from Princeton. Lance Gable is a professor of law at Wayne State University Law School. Professor Gable is an internationally known expert on public health law and bioethics. He's published journal articles on a diverse array of topics, including public health law, ethics and policy, international human rights, bioterrorism and emergency preparedness, mental health, research ethics, and information privacy. Prior to joining the Wayne Law faculty, Gable was a senior fellow at the Centers for Law and the Public's Health, a collaborative at Georgetown and Johns Hopkins Universities, affiliated with the World Health Organization and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He also was the Alfred P. Sloan Fellow in Bioterrorism Law and Policy at the Centers for Law and the Public's Health, and he practiced as a healthcare law attorney at a major firm in Washington, D.C. Gable earned his law degree from Georgetown University Law Center, a Master of Public Health from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and a BA in Political Science from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Jeffrey L. Ram has diverse research interests related to biodiversity, reproductive biology, neuroscience, invasive species, and human and environmental microbiology. As an associate in the Department of Biochemistry, Microbiology, and Immunology at Wayne State University, Dr. Ram connects technically and conceptually to research on the molecular detection and characterization of microorganisms in diverse habitats. These projects have included analyses not only of environmentally significant bacteria at beaches and microorganisms in the ballast water of ships, but also correlations of human oral and fecal microbiomes with disease and behavior, and most recently, the detection and quantitation of COVID-19 virus in wastewater. Panelists, please take it away.
Well, I want to thank you all for inviting us to be a part of this symposium today. It's a really great opportunity to be part of this conversation, to share our work. And I also want to specifically thank Ren Warden for all of the help that she and her team have given to us in the process of developing this article, and thank the University of Richmond School of Law for putting on this event in the first place. I feel when I look at the agenda for today's symposium, it really fits together very well, because what we're going to be talking about in our presentation today, I think, lines up really well with some of the discussions we've already been having about contact tracing, about health justice. And we're going to be focusing on wastewater monitoring, which is a technique that is increasingly being used as a public health tool to try to track the spread of COVID-19 in our communities, but also can potentially be used for a lot of other types of public health screening and surveillance. And of course, anytime you're talking about using tools for public health screening and surveillance, it raises a lot of ethical and legal issues. And so what we're going to focus on today are some of those issues, both in the context of looking at wastewater surveillance for purposes of COVID-19, but also for other types of purposes that this technology could be used for in the future going forward. So I wanted to start off with, actually, if you can go back one slide, I wanted to start off with a little bit of an explanation, because while many of you may have heard of wastewater monitoring, you might not know exactly what we're talking about here. And so basically, the way that this process works, we know from scientific research, and it was discovered really early on in the COVID-19 pandemic, that the virus that causes COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 virus, is shed in human waste. And so you can detect the virus in human waste. And because of that, there's an opportunity to try to track where outbreaks are occurring, or where there's a large amount of virus, by looking at the contents of that human waste. And so a person flushes the toilet, the waste goes down through the plumbing system into the sewer system, and researchers, technicians, scientists can go down and collect samples in the sewer of this human waste, and then using PCR technology, test that waste to determine whether or not it contains the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And using the analytical techniques that have been developed by scientists over the past couple of years, we can figure out through these techniques not only if there is any of the virus in the waste sample that's been collected, but we can also determine whether or not that waste sample is a really high amount of virus in the waste. And so the levels of virus can be measured, they can be tracked, they can be followed. And what this allows us to do then is to use this data to try to understand where COVID-19 is spreading in different parts of our community. Now, there are lots of potential ways that this data can be used. And in our article that's going to be forthcoming in the University of Richmond Law Review, we go through a number of potential uses of this wastewater surveillance information in the context of COVID-19 tracking. So first, the information we get from this process can be used to potentially serve as an early warning sign for new outbreaks or worsening outbreaks of COVID-19. We've seen in a number of places already throughout different waves of this pandemic that the wastewater signal for the SARS-CoV-2 virus increases prior to other kinds of metrics of testing. And so what this enables us to do is potentially know with a little bit of advance warning that the amount of virus that's spreading in the community is increasing, and can allow for interventions for other efforts to try to react to and respond to and mitigate the harm of that impending outbreak. Another commonly used, another benefit that this information can be used for is as a complement to all of the other kinds of initiatives that are going on to test and screen for COVID-19. We've been talking about contact tracing today. We've been talking about some other techniques as well. And so thinking about adding wastewater as another modality with which we can really track and know what's going on with this pandemic is a really potentially useful tool. And we've started to see this be used in a really widespread way. And we're going to get into some of the extent of that in our talk today. Now, another, and I'm not going to go through all of these proposed uses. We go through them in some detail in our paper. But one of the really important potential uses of this technique is that it can really be used for targeted screening and potentially targeted intervention. And so with the sampling processes going on in different sewer sheds around different cities and different communities around the country, and as is going on now, what we can figure out is if there's an outbreak in a particular neighborhood, if there's an outbreak in a particular, even potentially a particular facility, long-term care facility, congregate care facility, and potentially that information can then be used to provide extra resources, extra testing, target testing to residents of that neighborhood or facility, and to more rapidly intervene when there's an outbreak that is just starting to occur. Now, that being said, of course, that kind of targeted testing and intervention can raise concerns about privacy, can raise some concerns about the use of the data that's being collected, and we're going to get into some of those topics in our discussions today as well. And the last one I'll mention here is that the last bullet point on the slide here, COVID wastewater surveillance can be potentially used, as well as detecting the upcoming surge in COVID cases. It can also potentially be used to detect a reduction in those cases and provide information about when an outbreak is waning as well as starting. And again, this information is a little bit harder to predict from the data and from the science that we have on this screening as of now. So the scientists and researchers who've been looking at this have been trying to improve the causal link and the predictive value of some of this information. And as that improves, we might get to a point where we not only can detect when a pandemic or an outbreak is starting, but when it's also ending. And so there's a lot of really potential positive use from this technology, from this technique. But what we see is that there's some concerns as well. Because this is so promising, though, we've seen a huge increase in the infrastructure being built up around this surveillance. And so I'm going to turn it over to Natalie, and she's going to talk a little bit about that.
Great, thanks, Lance, and thanks also to Ren and all of the editors at the Richmond Law Review. This is such a wonderful conference, and I just want to reiterate what Lance said about how great it is to be a part of this, and this really stellar lineup of folks that you've included in this symposium. So to turn then briefly to the new investments and infrastructure, it is hard to understate the magnitude of investment in SARS-CoV-2 monitoring or monitoring for the virus that causes COVID-19. It has been substantial and very significant. So just to start, in 2020, the CDC initiated a national wastewater surveillance system. And since September 2020, the CDC has awarded grants totaling approximately $220 million for SARS-CoV-2 wastewater monitoring projects in 31 states, 3 local health departments, and 2 territorial public health departments. In addition to that, just to take the state of Michigan, which is where both Professor Gable and Dr. Ram are located and working on this issue, the state of Michigan has invested nearly $50 million of its own dollars to fund new wastewater monitoring capabilities in 19 labs across the state to monitor for COVID-19 virus. 2 internet sites, which are amazingly named COVID-19 Poops and Wastewater Sphere, have cataloged and mapped more than 90 COVID-19 related wastewater data dashboards that report data for more than 2,000 sites that are being monitored in more than 50 countries. And it's also worth noting that private enterprise is now entering the field. It's not just the CDC funding state and local governments. It's not just the state of Michigan or other states funding public universities. It's also private enterprise. So there are at least 2 private companies that are already up and running in the United States, Aquavitas and Biobot Analytics. Biobot Analytics, for its part, has reported providing SARS-CoV-2 wastewater monitoring services in at least 40 states. So we're seeing a lot of new investment, a lot of new infrastructure too. So it's one other thing to note is that although monitoring of wastewater isn't a new endeavor, the kind of biological monitoring that we see in response to COVID-19 represents a change in the type and purpose of monitoring from the past, as well as an increase by orders of magnitude in the kind of money and infrastructure being built out. So traditionally what has happened is that wastewater treatment plants are monitoring the discharge, the stuff that's leaving the wastewater treatment plant to make sure it's sufficiently clean enough. That's required by federal law. And monitoring what comes into the treatment plant or what is in the sewer itself typically hasn't been required under federal law. So monitoring for the COVID-19 virus in wastewater doesn't occur on the discharge side of the treatment plant. It occurs on the influent side. You know, the water flowing in the sewer and into the treatment plant, analyzing samples taken usually from sewers prior to reaching the plant or sometimes at the treatment plant itself. And so the influent monitoring itself is both a change in the type, influent versus outflow or effluent, and a change in the purpose of the wastewater monitoring, not monitoring for how clean it is, but in fact for what's in the wastewater itself. And so we're seeing just kind of a rapid scaling up of infrastructure, lots of money flowing in to fund this new purpose and type of monitoring. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Lance to talk about ethical guidelines for wastewater surveillance with a particular focus in COVID-19.
Thank you. So I think to kind of to set the stage here, and to maybe take a slight step back for a moment, when we think about public health surveillance, obviously there are lots of ways that you can conduct public health surveillance, and anytime you're collecting data about population health, but that also connects to potentially connects and creates the possibility of identifying health information about individuals, or even making generalizations about the health of communities. There needs to be an assessment of why that surveillance is being done, why that information is being collected. And if we're doing it for public health purposes, there's a long tradition of employing different techniques to try to collect this data because there's such an important population health benefit for this work. And so when we're examining wastewater surveillance, and in particular for COVID-19, you're looking for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, or if we're thinking about it more broadly, there are principles that we can apply to analyzing whether it's an ethical use of these techniques or not. We've really focused in our paper on trying to develop a set of guidelines that look at this, and our analysis focuses on a couple of core principles that we think are important in evaluating the ethicality, and then ultimately some of the legal implications of engaging in wastewater surveillance for purposes of public health. So the concern, of course, is that if this technique or future uses of this technique are being applied in a way that is premised on improving public health, but is also being used for other purposes, or perhaps if it's being premised on a public health purpose, but then that the actual implementation or the uses of those data that come out of that effort end up creating problematic consequences, then the efforts might not be appropriate, and might raise both ethical and legal problems. And so for example, if you're collecting data and you're using it in a way that leads to unnecessary coercive implementation of policies, or increases stigma or discrimination against certain communities, that's going to be very problematic and concerning. However, if you're using these techniques in a way that really is focused on improving public health, on tracking and quickly intervening to stop the spread of an outbreak like COVID-19, then you're going to be on much more solid ethical footing. And so, and I have to acknowledge that some of the analysis here, we draw very heavily from a really excellent 2017 World Health Organization report that creates that outlines ethical guidelines for public health surveillance generally. So we break this down into 4 categories. The first is the common good. So public health surveillance can be considered a common good, generally speaking, because of the potential to achieve really important, beneficial public health population level benefits. And so the WHO suggests that public health surveillance systems should undergo an assessment prior to them being implemented to ensure that the data are being collected for a clear and legitimate public health purpose, and also that any subsequent analysis, use, and dissemination of data collected from that process corresponds to that relevant and agreed upon public health priority. And in the context of COVID-19, these screening systems using wastewater surveillance appear to meet these standards. They are designed to rapidly identify the outbreaks as they're occurring, and to target resources to try to intervene, to mitigate the negative effects of those outbreaks. Now, one thing that is not clear from a lot of the development of these systems, of course, is what is the long-term implementation of these processes? Are we going to keep screening for COVID-19 in wastewater going forward indefinitely, or is there a certain point at which these systems are modified and maybe scaled back? Also, are there certain uses and ways that the data can be used that are off limits? Most of these systems have not really examined that, or at least have not made any kind of public information available about that. That would be essential to determine the common good usage of these data. And so equity is another really important consideration here. We've talked already a lot today in a couple of the presentations about the importance of ensuring that health policies and public health practices are centering equity, are acknowledging that that laws and policies and their implementation can often exacerbate inequity. We've really seen this very starkly during the COVID-19 response with communities that already faced pre-existing health disparities, having those health disparities exacerbated during the pandemic. Particularly Black communities, Indigenous communities, people with disabilities have faced a disproportionate negative impact from COVID-19 infection and death. And these systems are grounded in longstanding structural disparities, structural racism and ableism, longstanding disinvestment in vulnerable communities. And so obviously those are big problems that can't just be solved easily, but require a lot of concerted effort and investment. But when we think about something like wastewater surveillance, how can you incorporate health justice into a wastewater surveillance system? Well, for starters, you can ensure that the way that the data is being collected, where it's being collected, and how it's being used once it's collected does not impose additional unnecessary burdens on populations that are already more vulnerable. So for example, if the release of data is likely to generate additional discrimination or stigma towards people in particular communities or locations, that needs to be scrutinized and avoided. And then further, it's possible to think about the ways to use the system to increase equity. So if you're using wastewater screening to rapidly detect outbreaks and then to target more resources to communities that are facing those outbreaks, especially communities that might already not have access to a sufficient number of healthcare or public health resources, then that could have positive equity implications. On the other hand, if you're using this data to apply a disproportionately restrictive set of intervention measures on communities that are already vulnerable without providing the supportive resources, then that can have a negative impact on equity. And one specific example, a lot of the early work on wastewater surveillance for COVID has been focused in universities, so in part because universities have a lot of capacity to ramp up this kind of testing. But if you're focusing your surveillance efforts for COVID-19 in wastewater in universities, at the expense of investing in other areas that might be more vulnerable, that can have an overall reduction in the equity of allocation of those resources. I'll mention really quickly two more categories here. Respect for persons, of course, is important. Making sure that individual privacy, bodily integrity, autonomy, and other individual rights and interests are protected. And this really goes back to how the data is used once it's collected. Ensuring that systems of wastewater sampling and screening are not attempting to link data back to individuals and using it in a de-identified way, which is still really useful in the context of population community level screening for COVID-19. And for good governance, ensuring that there's transparency and built into the system, that as these systems are being developed and rolled out, that communities that are going to be participating in having their wastewater screened are aware that it's being screened, have the opportunity to raise concerns that they might have, and participate in the process, so that you can get community assent and ongoing communication, and also timely and transparent dissemination of results to the community, so that they know if there are outbreaks, they can have that information quickly. Now, the last thing that I'll mention before I turn it back over to Natalie is obviously there are a lot of legal implications to all of this as well. And in the context of SARS-CoV-2 wastewater screening, we've thought a lot about how this data that's being collected through this process, what legal implications it can have in terms of taking that data and then using it to implement public health intervention strategies to stop the spread of COVID-19. Obviously, privacy is one of the major considerations that we've thought about. And at least with the way that most of the wastewater screening has been done for SARS-CoV-2, it's being done in a de-identified way. It's being done in a way that could be used to target mitigation strategies at the community level, but has not really been used for individual attempts to impose public health powers to restrict the movements of individuals, like quarantine and isolation, alone. And so if that's happened, it's the signal from the wastewater that leads to further testing and screening that then may give rise to some of the other intervention strategies. But I think some of the early concern that this was going to be used to impose sort of widespread blanket quarantines on a facility or on a neighborhood, that has not borne out. And it's a good thing, because that would obviously raise some serious concerns, and also would face some serious legal scrutiny in terms of its constitutionality. And so I think to sum things up, a lot of the privacy and civil liberties concerns about SARS-CoV-2 wastewater screening have not risen to the level of really significant concern. But when we move forward and when we think about how this infrastructure could be deployed in the future, I think that raises these legal issues in a more potentially concerning way. And that's going to be my cue to turn it back over to Natalie. And she's going to talk about some of the future potential uses of this infrastructure and some of the implications of those uses.
Great, thanks, Lance. So, wastewater monitoring beyond COVID-19. So, as we've discussed, as wastewater surveillance efforts have spun up in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, many involved are creating that infrastructure not only with an eye, I think, towards monitoring for COVID-19, but also with an eye to the future. After all, if such tools can detect COVID-19 virus in wastewater, what else can they detect? On what scale and to what ends? And so the additional uses are many. I'll detail just a few of them just to give you an overview. So first, wastewater monitoring for other viral surveillance was already in use before the pandemic. There's an oft-cited precedent of wastewater monitoring for polio virus, where detection of that virus in wastewater in Israel prompted a massive vaccination campaign to control an outbreak. Tempe, Arizona, which I'll come back to a number of times, they've been kind of at the forefront of wastewater monitoring and surveillance. So Tempe has used wastewater to monitor for influenza virus and plans to use to test its use for monitoring for other viruses like measles. Researchers have suggested that these technologies and infrastructure could be applied to other viral targets as well, including hepatitis A, hepatitis E, norovirus, astrovirus, and others, all of which can be detected in wastewater. These and other viruses have been suggested as candidates for routine monitoring. Wastewater surveillance of a non-biological targets, including illicit drugs and pharmaceuticals, have also been proposed and in some places implemented. So these applications use the same sample collection infrastructure, but different analytical methods, right? They're just testing for something different. Even before COVID-19 arrived in the United States, Tempe, Arizona had already deployed wastewater surveillance to detect opioid use on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. More recently, the city expanded its routine wastewater surveillance efforts to include monitoring for, quote, molecular traces of alcohol, asthma medications, stress hormones, and biomarkers of exposure to toxic fumes like benzene. Several European projects have also deployed wastewater monitoring of opioids as a means to target drug control efforts. Cannabis products have been monitored in wastewater to determine the impact of legalization of marijuana. And more generally, researchers have noted an even broader range of targets and community quote unquote objectives, including monitoring for markers related to opioids, heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamines, alcohol consumption, tobacco use, and the metabolism of psychoactive substances. Meanwhile, wastewater surveillance by and for private entities is also growing, as I mentioned when I spoke briefly about the growth in infrastructure. Aquavitas, which is one of those private companies seeking to promote wastewater surveillance, explains on its website that it has, quote, examined hundreds of chemical and biological agents in municipal wastewater, including narcotics, opiates, influenza, COVID-19, stress hormones, alcohol, and nicotine. All of this, the company tells us, can assist, quote, public, private, corporate, and government entities to protect human health, maximize productivity, and minimize risk and liability. Already, the company's CEO has reported interest from one city about monitoring for molecules that people with Alzheimer's disease will shed into their blood and urine. Another city is interested in cancer, and a private high school client of Aquavitas that has a strict vegetarian diet policy has contracted with Aquavitas to look for signs that their students are sneaking animal products on the sly. So in light of this broad range of uses to which wastewater surveillance may be put, ethical and legal analysis of these kinds of secondary uses or follow-on uses for wastewater surveillance infrastructure and data is really urgently needed. And I want to turn now to consider some constitutional, or at least constitutional adjacent, concerns that may operate to constrain wastewater surveillance programs serving two different kinds of purposes, which I'm going to focus on here. One for law enforcement use, and the other for public health or wellness purposes. So typically, courts assessing the constitutionality of wastewater surveillance have done so in the context of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment of the US Constitution, of course, guarantees the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, ordinarily, that means that the government has to obtain a warrant supported by probable cause before it conducts a search intended to discover evidence of criminal conduct. But not all government efforts to ferret out unlawful conduct amount to a search. Rather, the US Supreme Court has explained that the government engages in a search only when the place, thing, including when the place, thing, or information that the government seeks to examine is one in which an individual has an expectation of privacy that society is prepared to recognize as reasonable. This is known, unsurprisingly, as the reasonable expectation of privacy test. So for the most part, courts who are adjudicating Fourth Amendment challenges to wastewater surveillance have concluded that there's no reasonable expectation of privacy in wastewater that is irretrievably flowing into the public sewer. Courts have likened wastewater to garbage left on the curb for municipal collection, which the Supreme Court has held is not subject to a reasonable expectation of privacy at all. No reasonable expectation of privacy means it's not a search, means the Fourth Amendment just doesn't apply. This seems pretty logical. After all, what's more waste-like than wastewater, right? But I think that there is space in this analysis for contrary conclusions to be drawn in at least some circumstances. So for one thing, the cases haven't precluded all such expectations of privacy, particularly where individual as opposed to corporate interests are at issue. Most of the cases involve corporate privacy interests, which courts have routinely explained corporate reasonable expectations of privacy are lesser than or different from the expectations of privacy that natural persons, real flesh and blood people, can have. Moreover, there's been recent judicial solicitude for Fourth Amendment claims in inescapably shared and yet deeply sensitive personal data that may suggest that the analogy to garbage left at the curbside is not on point, or maybe even that the old garbage case should be revisited. The Supreme Court has recognized that the collection and analysis of biological samples, including urine, intrude upon reasonable expectations of privacy and thus constitute searches governed by the Fourth Amendment. And so that raises a question about whether the fact that wastewater surveillance collects that biological sample from the sewer rather than at its source, does that render the expectation of privacy unreasonable? In some ways, the answer might appear to be yes, but the Supreme Court has also recently suggested that the answer could, at least in some instances, be no, that there would be a reasonable expectation of privacy, even when it comes to wastewater. So in a 2018 decision called the United States versus Carpenter, the Supreme Court identified 4 features of large data collections. There it was digital data collections that persuaded it that government access to that data constituted a Fourth Amendment search. And although Carpenter involved cell phone location data, which may seem very, very far removed from wastewater data, I think the court's analysis in Carpenter can be instructive. So among other features, the court emphasized that the data in question in Carpenter was both deeply sensitive in that it reveals the whole of an individual's personal movements, and that it's not genuinely voluntarily shared. And the court explained that that the modern cell phone is both a necessity of modern life and ubiquitous. Now, our contributions to wastewater can be similarly sensitive, and they are definitely inescapable. Nearly 80% of US households are connected to municipal sewer systems. Biologically, individuals have to use the bathroom several times a day. And by law, you're supposed to put your waste in a toilet, not on the sidewalk. And so courts, I think, should recognize that wastewater surveillance of natural persons may, at least some of the time, in some instances, raise Fourth Amendment concerns. Now, you might respond, how can the Fourth Amendment possibly apply given, as Lance said, that wastewater surveillance typically occurs on a population-wide basis. And so any single individual's input is irretrievably mixed with the input from others, the waste of others. Okay, so in one sense, I might suggest that population-wide surveillance might raise additional concerns, insofar as it might create a too permeating form of surveillance, which the Supreme Court has expressed skepticism about. In another way, the population level data collection could indeed negate the Fourth Amendment's applicability. Irretrievably aggregate data, as Lance pointed out, at least, in theory, poses very little risk to individual privacy because little individualized information is discernible. And contrary to many other de-identified or aggregate data sets, wastewater appears to be genuinely aggregate data where you can't separate out often when you're looking at a full sewer shed stream or at the water treatment plant where a particular signal ultimately originated from, which house, right? But wastewater surveillance is not inherently or necessarily aggregate in the data that it discloses. Private companies engaged in wastewater surveillance are already touting the increasing granularity of their data. For instance, BioBot explains that it analyzes wastewater, quote, before it converges and mixes downstream in treatment facilities, which enables the company to measure drug use, not only of an entire city, but also of specific locations down to areas of a few thousand people. Similarly, Aquavitas has disclosed a proposal, as I said, for monitoring for animal proteins in the wastewater of a single school, suggesting that small-scale data may be realizable and with the ability to identify individual rule breakers. Existing COVID-19 wastewater programs also suggest that single block or even single building surveillance is within reach of current efforts, as in the case of nursing homes or dormitories. Existing monitoring already approaches individualized levels, including wastewater monitoring of sewer sheds containing as few as 100 people. And I would suggest that somewhere along the spectrum, from an entire wastewater treatment plant drainage system to a neighborhood sewer shed, to a nursing home or a meat processing plant, to a single home, somewhere along that spectrum, wastewater surveillance may well disclose sufficiently individualized information to implicate the Fourth Amendment. Now, don't panic. I'm not suggesting that COVID-19 wastewater surveillance should require a warrant. Even in instances where wastewater surveillance may constitute a Fourth Amendment search, and again, at a sufficiently broad community-based level, the Fourth Amendment is likely to fall away. But even in instances where wastewater surveillance may constitute a Fourth Amendment search, the purpose of that search may affect its constitutionality. So the Supreme Court has, broadly speaking, distinguished between searches conducted pursuant to the state's general interest in law enforcement and those justified by special needs, which are divorced from a law enforcement interest. The former, law enforcement interest, typically requires a warrant, and programmatic or suspicionless searches are largely forbidden. Under the special needs doctrine, by contrast, reasonableness is the hallmark, and a warrant is typically not required. Law enforcement use of wastewater surveillance information to investigate individuals, for instance, for purposes of drug enforcement, drug law enforcement, would likely fail Fourth Amendment analysis in the absence of a warrant. But many other uses of wastewater surveillance would proceed under a special needs analysis, and a warrant wouldn't be required. I do want to caution that the mere invocation of public health or community wellness ought not to insulate these programs from critical review. At a minimum, because the special needs analysis includes consideration of whether the contemplated searches are likely to succeed, the assessment ought to and really must include an explicit analysis of whether the program's goals, methods, and data are reasonably justified on a scientific basis. So under that rubric, wastewater surveillance efforts might raise concerns insofar as they seek medically sensitive information in the absence of a robust scientific basis or plans for acting in response to the data signal. Wastewater surveillance focused on COVID-19 would very likely satisfy the demands of the special needs analysis, particularly if it's conducted along the lines that Lance discussed. I am less certain, though, about some other uses of this technology. You might question, for instance, what Tempe, Arizona hopes to learn by monitoring its wastewater for stress hormones and what it plans to do if that data reveals a spike in hormones. If the city's goal is to gain a rough measure of the a citizen's mental health, you might express concern not only about the scientific validity of that surveillance tool, but also, frankly, about the propriety of the city government inquiring into its residents' mental health en masse. Finally, even if I'm wholly wrong, and wastewater surveillance programs rarely or never constitute searches for purposes of the Fourth Amendment, I still think the analysis I've set forth should inform our policy debates surrounding the deployment and use of these programs in any event. And that's because of the use of wastewater-derived data for law enforcement or for generalized wellness purposes without a sound scientific basis can undermine public trust that is essential for successful and well-grounded public health efforts to flourish. And here, I really want to link our talk and our paper to the other papers we've already heard about in this symposium. In fact, our paper cites Professor Roberts' paper on digital contact tracing and its framing for public health and national security. So public discomfort and mistrust of some wastewater surveillance efforts may spread and effectively contaminate or undermine other less controversial interventions. The public response to the COVID-19 pandemic writ large is illustrative, right? So skepticism expressed by some about COVID-19 vaccines and whether they work, they do. But that skepticism has fed into political resistance to vaccination requirements. And unfortunately, that resistance in turn has amplified the existing anti-vax movement that has attacked other well-established requirements for childhood vaccination. We have yet to see whether those movements will exact legal change and just distort or undermine existing school vaccination policies. I think it would be a real mistake were that to happen. In the context of wastewater surveillance, more specifically, invasive wastewater surveillance programs that seek to ferret out sensitive medical information about the populace or to tie individuals to criminal wrongdoing through their unavoidable effluence might cast a pall on wastewater monitoring writ broadly. Regardless of whether such surveillance ultimately impinges on constitutionally protected privacy interests. If this happens, the public might well reject as illegitimate other uses of this technology, included well-grounded, scientifically valid uses that may be crucial for successful public health efforts. As a result, policymakers contemplating wastewater surveillance have to establish appropriate processes to regulate the use of this technology and ensure its application only for ethically, legally, and scientifically justified applications. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Thank you, Lance and Natalie and Jeff. So we can jump right into our Q&A portion now. The first question that we have is an international question. In some countries where waste systems might not be as developed and private companies might be as involved as they are here, what might it take to implement wastewater monitoring for disease tracing, prevention, and control? And that's just for anyone.
Lance or Jeff, you want to?
Well, I would like to say that there have been articles published from various countries where the health systems are less developed and sewage systems are not as well developed as well. South Africa, Brazil are two that I know of that have said wastewater monitoring where they can do it has been useful for alerting communities when COVID-19 has come to their community in a way to help various mitigation efforts. But it is a problem places where there's not as developed infrastructure to do so.
Yeah, and one thing I would add to that is that this obviously kind of connects back to some of the discussions about equity as well, because if we're relying on this approach as a primary way to detect an emerging outbreak, and there are some communities that can't participate in this kind of surveillance because there's not a sufficiently developed sewer system to do the testing in the first place, then there's a risk those communities get left out of that early detection and then might not get resources in a timely way. But of course, that kind of concern is, it's a broader concern about access to resources and development in many different parts of the world. And I think that the solution, I mean, obviously increasing access to early detection is an important goal, but also increasing access to plumbing and sanitation is also an important public health goal. And so I think those things kind of go hand in hand.
In those countries which have a zero, excuse me, I'm sorry for interrupting you, Natalie, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to note that, as I said, about 80% of households in the United States are connected to municipal water systems. I suspect, though I haven't actually seen the map of this, that that many of the households that are not connected to municipal water systems are in rural parts of the country. Now, those may be also less well-resourced areas in other ways as well. And so we might think about the ways in which focusing more and more on wastewater monitoring as a primary tool might disadvantage detection in those kinds of communities. Did you want to add anything else?
I was just going to say, in those countries who have pursued a zero COVID policy, wastewater testing has been part of the combination of data that they collected in order to trigger, for example, massive testing of people. Not only the case rates, which have been kept low, but also what they find in wastewater to increase surveillance.
Great. So the next question, is there a regulatory agency that oversees wastewater surveillance? Is that the EPA? Is it something else? And then if so, what are their responsibilities and what do they do?
In the state of Michigan, it's the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. They communicate frequently with the CDC, and they've just begun reporting data from Michigan to the CDC. So you can find, besides the websites that Natalie mentioned, you can find state of Michigan websites and a CDC website that's giving information as to whether the pandemic is, case rates are going, wastewater levels are going up or down. As far as the relation to case rates, that's another sort of analysis. But those are the agencies that we communicate with. Interestingly enough, in Michigan, the program of wastewater testing began under the supervision of the Department of Environment and Great Lakes and Energy, which had a beach testing program that was already using a small amount of the types of equipment that they then funded for 20 laboratories around the state to begin testing more frequently in more places, not just at beaches.
And as far as Virginia goes, I have a comment in the Q&A box. The Virginia Department of Health supervises wastewater surveillance in Virginia. So our next question, you mentioned earlier good governance as an ethical guideline of wastewater monitoring. What exactly does that mean, and how can we ensure good governance when there are so many concerns about privacy?
That's a great question. I think, well, so a couple of points. I think good governance is both about process and about the sort of substantive decisions that are being made. But on the process side of things, having an open discussion about the purposes of this technique, why are we doing wastewater surveillance? What is the goal? How does it help us try to protect communities against COVID-19 outbreaks or potentially against other kinds of public health threats? And I think if we're going to implement these systems, having that discussion and having a process where the community understands what's going on and that it's very clear what's being done to collect the data and also how the data is being used, releasing the data in a timely way and in a thorough way that doesn't implicate privacy concerns, but that does provide information to the community so that they know if virus is circulating in their community. And I think those kinds of having those steps in place are part of good governance. I think also, having kind of clearly stated expectations for how these systems are going to change over time. So, right now we're still experiencing, really significant levels of COVID-19 infection and spread of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. We are by no means done with this pandemic, unfortunately. And so subsequent waves of cases and surges in infections are still ongoing. And so having really aggressive active monitoring right now makes a whole lot of sense from a public health perspective. I think there's a question, how long do we sustain the system? Is this just kind of a permanent infrastructure that we create, or does it change over time as the risk hopefully dissipates over time? And I think being upfront about what the metrics and criteria are for the use of these systems is something that's important to talk about, and it's a part of good governance. And then I think, making sure that the people who are involved in the decision making aren't, so making sure that they are well informed about the appropriate purposes and maybe the inappropriate potential uses of these systems, to make sure that that there isn't that mission creep that I know Professor Roberts was talking about that earlier in the context of contact tracing technology. Keeping an eye on that and making sure that that's part of the way the system is designed, so that people don't forget in a couple of years why we created these systems in the first place and just start using them for all sorts of other things because they're there, without reflecting on the potential implications of that use.
I also want to just weigh in briefly to expand on a point that Lance made, which is that in some ways one of the upsides of wastewater monitoring could potentially be that you can do it without people even knowing about it, because you're sampling from the sewer. You don't have to go ask anybody's permission, logistically. But that good governance really requires engagement with the community whose wastewater is going to be sampled and analyzed, and that having that public conversation and public dialogue is actually essential for good governance and ethical deployment of this technology.
So in fact, part of our project is to go and communicate the meaning of this data. And we have a student who's our communications specialist. And in the last week, she's given 3 talks, 2 of them on the Wayne State campus and 1 up in Flint, Michigan, where we're not doing sampling. Actually, the University of Michigan is doing sampling there, but they invited us to talk about what was the use of wastewater monitoring. And we hope that community forum will, help in that transparency and understanding of why we're doing that. And also, it's not us telling them, we want to find out what the concerns of people in the community are. They may have questions, and they may also wonder, what's that truck coming every week or every couple of days to pull a manhole cover and collect some sewage? They may have some concern about scientists coming to study their neighborhood, and why are they coming to study us? So that we would like to talk to people in the community and make sure that we understand their concerns.
When you are connecting with the community and making sure they kind of understand what's going on and address their concerns, how do you get them past the kind of ick factor of wastewater surveillance?
Oh, that's a really good question. I certainly have encountered that in other work that we've done, where we have collected with all sorts of consents individual fecal samples as reference material. Some people really react completely negatively to that. And if somebody's a nurse, they don't mind at all, for example. That is a problem. I guess you just have to communicate as well as possible that this is to help the general health of the community, provide for the common good, and people feel that that is an appropriate goal.
And I think we have one more question in our Q&A box. We have gone over this kind of a little bit earlier in previous presentations, a lot of times from contact tracing to space exploration, it's easier for these scientific endeavors and regulatory endeavors to happen when government and corporations collaborate. So how are the private enterprises that are working on these projects, how are they being regulated, if at all?
That is a great question. I am not aware of a whole lot of regulatory infrastructure in this space. I mean, as we've said, it's a pretty new domain. Monitoring what is discharged from wastewater treatment plants is longstanding, but monitoring on the influence side, less so. And it's only in the last, couple of years that we've seen a lot of money and infrastructure pouring into this space. Now, some of, Aquavitas and BioBot predate the pandemic, I believe. I know BioBot does, but they, their their list of the salience of their work, I think, has increased substantially in light of the pandemic. And so I suspect that there could be more regulatory efforts than are probably currently in place. I suspect if there are probably state and local departments of health are working with these entities. And if it's really just a private company selling a service to a private entity, right, an employer, a nursing home, a private school that wants to monitor for kids breaking the vegetarian policy, it's not actually clear who would regulate that and in what ways. Now, there might be, like biosafety hazard regulation, right? But in terms of regulation of what is permissible to test for and in what ways, I suspect there isn't a lot in that regard. Lance, does that sound right to you?
Yeah, that sounds right. I'm not aware of much regulation either. I know, I mean, at the actual collection level, there's going to be there's regulation of who can access the sewer shed areas, and those are being controlled by public utilities and others. But I don't know how carefully that's even enforced. And so but obviously if a private company just started on its own collecting a bunch of samples in public sewers, that I'm sure that would run afoul of some existing local regulations for access to those areas and that collection. But oftentimes this is being done with the cooperation between the public, the government and the private entities, because they're doing so with permission, and that becomes less relevant in terms of how this ends up playing out. And so, but again, I do think down the line, especially depending on how widespread this remains in a post-COVID world and what it's being used for, especially if there is community pushback or kind of publicly voiced concern about these efforts, that could spur additional regulation, which could in turn, there might be some advantages to that, but there also might be some disadvantages in that Natalie was mentioning earlier how a loss of public trust can undermine kind of longstanding public health efforts, and so that could be a result of not being upfront about this whole process as well. And so I think it's a real concern. I mean, we have seen a lot of efforts to curtail public health authority because of the widespread outpouring of publicly expressed concern about some of the public health interventions and mitigation strategies taken during the pandemic. And we're seeing a lot of state legislatures trying to roll back public health powers right now. That's something that in the long term really undermines the ability to do relevant public health work and to prevent the spread of this disease or ones that might come in the future.
I think we have one more question that just popped in the chat. It seems like one of the underlying rationales for saying that there's no reasonable expectation of privacy in curbside trash is the individual's choice to leave their trash to be taken away. Do you think that the lack of choice for waste disposal in many areas should factor into the individual's reasonable expectation of privacy?
Oh, absolutely. So this is one of those factors that came up quite seriously in the Carpenter decision, which again was about cell phone location data. And the voluntariness with which we carry around a cell phone is, I suspect, greater than the voluntariness with which we use toilets. It is not illegal not to have a cell phone. It is unlawful to, put your waste somewhere other than a proper receptacle. And so it is in fact less voluntary than the kind of cell phone location data. Now, there's been some work in the criminal law sphere, the criminal procedure sphere, tracking how courts are utilizing and responding to the Carpenter decision, how it's being applied to other kinds of data collections, and how those different factors are being weighted. Voluntariness seems to be relevant some of the time, but not all of the time. Which makes sense when you think about ways in which courts have construed what counts as voluntary, right? The idea that you have no expectation of privacy, and I will really try to keep this brief. The reason that you have no expectation of privacy in your trash is that you knowingly abandon it at the curbside. And so anyone could go through your trash, just like the folks picking up the trash. Now, in Carpenter itself, Justice Gorsuch, who nominally dissented in that case, but basically articulated a theory by which he would have agreed with the majority's conclusion that law enforcement access to the cell phone location data is a search, the Fourth Amendment ought to apply, et cetera, et cetera. He actually has in his opinion that he is skeptical about this holding about municipal trash on the curb, no expectation, no Fourth Amendment interests attached. So he's skeptical of that. So we know that there's at least, one possible vote on the court to revisit that case. But certainly the relationship between voluntariness and expectations of privacy is even more attenuated when we're talking about wastewater than when we're talking about trash on the curb. Yes.
Okay, Natalie Ram, Lance Gable, and Jeff Ram, thank you all very much for a lively conversation. Everyone, if you're interested in learning about more, their paper, The Future of Wastewater Monitoring for the Public Health, is forthcoming in the University of Richmond Law Review Symposium issue. We're going to take a lunch break. We're going to reconvene at 1 o'clock with the next presentation on drug-resistant tuberculosis control by Professor Polly Price. Thank you. See you all soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.